Alexander was certain that he would never forget this scene for the rest of his life: the eerie and dangerous boundless sea, a magnificent coffin bobbing with the waves, and a Gothic doll driven by a mysterious force standing in the coffin, holding a huge coffin board in its hands, riding the wind and waves. And it didn't seem too happy. From any perspective, this was too strange, so much so that for a moment, Alexander didn't know whether to be surprised that the cursed doll was actually moving or to be shocked by her momentum as she wielded the coffin board. He just felt that this scene was contrary to his initial imagination. He had imagined several times how the other party would return to the ship, but never such a scene. And the moment Alexander was stunned, the doll had already approached the stern of the lost home. Despite using a coffin board, her speed was astonishingly fast, and she had an unusual agility and strength. Alexander carefully peeked out of the observation port and saw the doll throw the coffin board into the coffin, then reached out to grab a piece of wood protruding from the stern of the ship and began to climb quickly, as agile and swift as if an invisible rope was pulling her up. The seemingly heavy wooden box mysteriously floated up from the sea, as if it had lost its weight and was floating beside the doll. Alexander quickly withdrew his head before the doll noticed him. The doll, however, apparently didn't notice that the captain of this ghost ship had been observing her in secret. She climbed onto the towering stern of the lost home in the blink of an eye, jumped onto the deck with a flip, and then waved her finger in the air, causing the coffin floating beside her to land steadily at her feet. She then looked around, seemingly assessing the situation on the deck. After confirming that there was no one around, she quickly adjusted her slightly wet dress and began to crawl into the coffin with both hands and feet. She was halfway in when she was stopped by a pirate sword that suddenly appeared from the side, followed by the click of a flintlock hammer being raised. The doll's movements froze instantly. She tried to turn her head, but saw a spectral captain wrapped in green flame standing coldly next to her, his voice cold and deep as if coming from the depths of the spirit world. "Oh, I've caught you, doll." Before Alexander's eyes, the doll visibly shivered. She seemed to be frightened and wanted to instinctively dodge to the side, but in her haste, her movements were a bit off, and her upper body swayed. Alexander heard a crisp click from the doll's shoulder and neck, then her head fell off. Right before Alexander's eyes, a beautiful head fell from the doll's body, her silver hair spreading in the sea breeze, then wrapping around the head as it rolled to his feet. The doll's body still maintained the posture of preparing to run away next to the coffin, one hand aimlessly grasping in midair, the head helplessly staring at Alexander, mouth opening and closing. "Help, help, help," without exaggeration, Alexander's heart seemed to stop beating at this moment, although he doubted whether his heart still existed when he was burned by the phantom flame. Witnessing the scene of the Gothic doll's head falling off still brought him a deep shock. However, the raging phantom flames concealed his shocked expression at the moment, and his momentary hesitation was misunderstood by the doll as indifference, so much so that the Gothic doll didn't realize that this terrifying spectral captain seemed to be more nervous than herself, just kept repeating, "Help, help, my head fell off." Alexander finally reacted. He calmed his heart, which only existed in his imagination, and tried his best to control his movements and voice. With the greatest calmness and composure, he observed the Gothic doll for a while, confirming that although this Gothic doll had many strange things about it, it seemed, compared to the strange nature he possessed, she seemed to be more afraid of him. The spectral captain. The moment he realized this, Alexander knew he had to maintain this calmness. He didn't know this world yet, let alone this Gothic doll, and until he could completely control the situation, the identity of the terrifying spectral captain was his biggest reliance for ensuring safety. On the other hand, he couldn't just ignore this doll. Although the development of things didn't quite match his initial speculation, but from the result, this doll was, after all, able to communicate with him. He put away the flintlock pistol, and held the sword in his other hand, at close range. A flintlock pistol with only one shot was obviously not as reliable as a sword, not to mention that his hasty practice of gunmanship was far from making him a skilled gunman. Then he used his free hand to pick up the doll's head that had fallen to the ground. This feeling was very strange. Even though he knew that the other party was just a Gothic doll, the feeling of picking up a head still made Alexander feel a little uncomfortable in his heart, and the slight warmth that came from this head almost made him want to throw it away. It was too strange and eerie, but in the end, he managed to control the strange feelings in his heart, calmly looking into the eyes of the head. "Do you need me to put it back for you?" Self, okay, you do it yourself." Alexander nodded, casually handing the head to the doll's hand that was aimlessly grasping in midair. Then he saw those hands expertly and deftly catch her own head, even casually fixing the somewhat disheveled silver hair, adjusting the angle, and placing the head on the neck, accompanied by a crisp click. The ball joint was perfectly aligned. The whole process was smooth and flowing, obviously not the first time doing this. Then the doll's somewhat stiff face quickly became animated. She blinked, exhaled, "Phew. I'm alive." Alexander, from any perspective, he felt that he should make a comment, but thinking about his spectral captain persona and the unknown details of the doll in front of him, he just nodded at the doll in the end. "Good, now come with me. You've been coming to my ship over and over again. We need to talk." As he spoke, he dispersed the phantom flames entwining his body, returning to his original form. Actively transforming into a phantom form was a power Alexander had mastered after taking hold of the helm of the lost home, but this was something he had come into contact with in a hurry, and he was far from proficient in it, let alone knowing how to use this power. Apart from being able to use it to steer the ship, he didn't even know what other functions this thing had. Just now, he had just released it to create a strong image in front of the eerie cursed doll, and to boost his own morale. Now that the image has been established and the doll is cooperative, it's no longer necessary to maintain the consuming phantom flames. The cursed doll obediently got up from the side of the phantom coffin, and then was surprised to see Alexander's process of returning to human form, her eyes wide open. You're not a ghost. Alexander gave her a faint look. When necessary, I can be. The doll raised a hand to touch her head, a look of awe in her eyes. Alexander didn't know what she was in awe of, but he could see that her head still didn't seem very sturdy. It might have almost been scared off just now that he turned and walked towards the cabin of the spectral captain, and through the soul link with the lost home, he could feel that the doll, after a brief hesitation of 1 or 2 seconds, also obediently followed. As expected, the magnificent and strange phantom coffin also closely floated behind the doll. It seemed that she had to take it with her wherever she went. A moment later, Alexander brought the cursed doll into the cabin of the spectral captain under the watchful eyes of the unicorn head. The spectral captain and the cursed doll sat across from each other at the navigation table. Alexander sat in his black captain's chair, and the doll across from him used the wooden box that looked like a coffin as a chair, sitting elegantly and dignifiedly on top. She was indeed elegant and dignified. When she sat down and kept quiet, when her silver hair was loose and she was dressed in a Gothic long dress sitting on the wooden box, she was as elegant and beautiful as an artwork that should be placed in a palace and guarded by guards. Unfortunately, every time Alexander saw her, he would think of the process of the lady riding the wind and waves and acting separately. Just now, he sighed, resumed his cold and majestic demeanor, and stared into the doll's eyes. Name? Alice. Race? Doll. Occupation? Doll. Why are you asking these? Alexander thought for a moment, to get some basic understanding. Alice, a doll, why are you asking these? Alexander thought for a moment, just to have some basic understanding. In the expansive navigation room of the Wanderer, Captain Alexander sat opposite the cursed puppet Isabella. The atmosphere between them was far from harmonious. The puppet lady who called herself Isabella still appeared somewhat nervous. Despite the temporary safety promised by the ghostly captain before her, the inherently authoritative face of Alexander made it impossible for her, a cursed puppet, to be at ease. At this moment, she was sitting primly on her coffin lid, her fingers clasped tightly around the hem of her dress, betraying her unease. Alexander, on the other hand, remained silent for the moment, observing the lady before him. A puppet driven by an unknown force, a creature clearly not of flesh and blood, yet capable of speech, movement, and even possessing some semblance of body temperature. Supernatural entity. If this were back in his homeland, it would be a mystery to be explored, and one that could likely be explored for quite some time. Alexander did not know what kind of existence a puppet like Isabella represented in this world. However, through his dealings with the goat-headed creature over the past few days, he had gleaned some information. While this world did have supernatural phenomena, such phenomena were not commonly seen. And the puppet lady before him? Alexander speculated that even in this bizarre world, she must represent some kind of special existence. His guess was not baseless. The steam-powered ship that had collided head-on with the Wanderer was new and manned by a well-trained crew. He had seen with his own eyes that, despite their overwhelming fear, many of the sailors had remained at their posts. There were also numerous rooms and items on board the ship whose purpose he could not discern. Many of these items bore intricate symbols that closely matched those on Isabella's sarcophagus. In other words, such an advanced warship was likely dispatched to escort, or rather, transport Isabella, the cursed puppet. Alexander shifted in his carved chair, looking at Isabella with a relaxed but serious gaze. There was no doubt that there was a significant guest on his ship. But on the other hand, this puppet lady didn't seem to be a threat at all. She seemed quite timid. After all, she was terrified when they first met, and he hadn't even said anything at that time. Excuse me. Perhaps the prolonged silence and scrutiny from Alexander was too much to bear. Isabella finally spoke up. Is there? Where do you come from? Alexander finally withdrew his intense gaze, asking in a more neutral tone. Isabella was obviously taken aback, seemingly trying to grasp the meaning of Alexander's question. After a few seconds, she gently tapped the exquisite wooden coffin beneath her. From here. Alexander's expression stiffened momentarily. I know you were lying in this coffin, he coughed lightly, but what I was asking is where you come from, a location, do you understand? Do you have a hometown? Or something that could be called a point of origin? Isabella thought for a moment before shaking her head. I can't remember. You can't remember? What home can a puppet have? Isabella placed her hands on her lap, responding with a dignified and serious expression. Most of my memories are of lying in this coffin. I lay there, being transported from one place to another. Occasionally, I could vaguely sense people moving or standing guard outside the coffin. I also remember some whispered conversations. The people guarding my coffin spoke in hushed, nervous tones about various things. Alexander raised an eyebrow. What did they talk about? Just mundane matters. But I'm curious. Alexander stated seriously. He believed that these were indeed mundane matters, but at this point, he needed to know as much as possible about this world, even if it was just the idle chatter of ordinary people. Alright then, the most common thing I heard was a code name, Anomaly 099. It seems they used this to refer to me and my coffin, but I don't like it. I have a name, Isabella said as she recalled. Aside from that, they occasionally spoke about seals and curses, but most of it is a blur. I sleep in the coffin and don't pay much attention to the noises outside. The puppet spoke unhurriedly, then seemed to remember something, but I do remember something recent. It was before I came to your ship. The voices outside the coffin frequently mentioned a place, the city-state of Belgavia. That seemed to be their destination, and mine. Belgavia? Alexander's gaze softened as he silently committed the name to memory. He had finally learned something useful, although he didn't know when this information would come in handy. He lifted his head and once again focused on the puppet lady before him. Anything else? Other than sleeping in the coffin, not much else, Captain, Isabella replied earnestly. When you're sealed in a coffin-like box and surrounded by murmuring voices that make you feel drowsy, what else can you do? Sit-ups in the coffin? Alexander's lips twitched. Isabella was dignified and elegant, but she could also make crude remarks and sail the seas on her coffin lid. He quickly formed a new impression of her. However, he maintained his composed and stern captain's facade, merely nodding in acknowledgement before speaking. So, you know nothing about the outside world. You can't tell me how the world has changed, nor can you tell me where any port or city-state is located. I'm afraid so, Captain, Isabella nodded seriously, her eyes widening in alarm as she realized something. So, are you planning to throw me off the ship again? Because I'm of no value? Before Alexander could respond, Isabella continued, all right, I understand. It's your ship after all. But could you not stuff gunpowder and cannonballs into the coffin this time? Honestly, 8 cannonballs were a bit excessive. It was clear that Isabella was not in a good mood, but she didn't dare to show it. Alexander was also feeling awkward. He hadn't considered the possibility of having a civil discussion with Isabella about the cannonballs when he had stuffed them into the coffin. At that time, he had only considered Isabella as a typical cursed puppet from a horror film. His mind was filled with images of horror and dread. He never imagined that this cursed puppet wasn't from a horror movie, but from a medieval castle cursed by language. As a result, the preparations he had made to combat the horror curse had now become a source of embarrassment. However, one of Alexander's strengths was his thick skin. His stern and imposing face was like a mask carved by swords and axes. As long as his peripheral nerves didn't short-circuit, he could remain calm. Thus, he chose to ignore the awkwardness caused by the 8 cannonballs and simply shook his head. I haven't decided whether to throw you off the ship yet. After all, you seem to always find a way back on. I'm just curious, why do you insist on returning to the Wanderer time and time again? It's clear that you're afraid of me and of this ship. If that's the case, why not distance yourself from this danger? Is this ship called the Wanderer? Well, I am a bit scared of you and your ship. But compared to that, isn't the deep sea far more dangerous? Isabella quietly stared at the ghostly captain before her. In her field of vision, this tall man was backed by an endless expanse of dark nothingness. This darkness overlapped with the real scenery of the cabin, as if 2 worlds had been forcibly superimposed. But compared to this suffocatingly vast void, the things that came from the deep depths of the boundless sea posed a far greater danger to her. Anomaly 099, in this world, is there anything more terrifying than the deep sea? The abyssal sea region is something to be feared. Isabella is a cursed puppet, yet she still possesses expressive eyes capable of conveying emotions and an inexplicable range of facial expressions, which allows Alexander to distinctly discern from her demeanor a fear and aversion towards the abyssal sea region, or rather, certain entities within the abyssal sea region. Considering his prior encounters with the domain of souls and the so-called marginal illusions at sea, he easily comes to the realization that the vast Odyssey sea he is currently traversing undoubtedly harbors great horrors. Yet, the ship named Wanderer sails through this boundless Odyssey sea, as does the cog ship they collided within the domain of souls. This prompts him to wonder about matters even more distant. What is the Terrace continent in this world like? Or rather, does a normal Terrace continent even exist in this world? However, the cursed puppet before him cannot answer his questions. Most of Isabella's memories are in a state of stupor, which Alexander deduces to be an effect of some kind of sealing magic or suppression magic. He still remembers what he saw in the cog ship's cabin when the Wanderer sailed past it. The mysterious runes, the sacred symbols, and the inscriptions on the outside of Isabella's soul coffin all indicated one thing: this cursed puppet is surely deeply feared in the civilized world. Alexander gave the cursed puppet a meaningful glance, which she returned with a calm and quiet look. Let's confirm this once again. You have absolutely no recollection of where you came from or what your past experiences are, correct? I don't remember, Isabella answered earnestly. Ever since I gained consciousness, I've always been lying in this large box. I don't know why, but there always seems to be a group of anxious people around me who are afraid of me coming out. They use various methods to seal the box. To be honest, thinking back on it now, the ring of nails you hammered into my coffin lid seems rather friendly. Even though you added 8 cannonballs later, at least you didn't fill it with lead, right? This time, Alexander didn't pay attention to Isabella's nonsense, but asked, where did your name come from then? Who gave it to you? If you've never left the box and never interacted with anyone else, why do you have a name? Did you give it to yourself? Isabella was suddenly taken aback. She seemed genuinely confused, remaining in a daze for 10 or so seconds. Just as Alexander was worried that this cursed puppet might have a system crash setting, she finally started moving again. I don't remember. I've always known that my name was Isabella, but I didn't give myself this name, she mumbled in confusion, subconsciously holding her head. This startled Alexander, who quickly stopped her. All right, if you don't remember, that's fine. You don't need to pull your head off, Isabella. After this, Alexander asked the cursed puppet many other questions, but unfortunately, most of them didn't yield any results. As the cursed puppet herself stated, most of her conscious time was spent in a state of stupor inside the soul coffin, alternating between deep sleep and semi-consciousness. She knew very little about the outside world, and what little knowledge she did have came from the conversations she heard outside the soul coffin during her semi-conscious periods. These scattered pieces of information were almost useless for Alexander to piece together a picture of this world. However, even so, Alexander did gain something from his conversation with Isabella. He was at least able to confirm a few things. In this world, there exists a power structure known as the city-state alliance. This term came up repeatedly in Isabella's narrative, practically constituting her entire journey. Her original destination for this journey was a city-state alliance called Provence, which was said to hold a significant position on many trade routes. Secondly, Isabella also had the title of Phantom 099, which seemed to be some kind of official title in the civilized world. As for the name Isabella that she herself mentioned, it seemed that no one else knew it except for her and Alexander. Lastly, Isabella was constantly being transferred from one city-state alliance to another, and it seemed that she wasn't the only phantom being transferred. During some of her journeys, she heard the people responsible for her escort mention terms like other sealed spaces in their conversations. Based on this, Alexander boldly guessed that perhaps the act of constantly moving the phantoms was a necessary measure to seal the phantoms and prevent them from escaping. Obviously, the team responsible for transporting Phantom 099 this time had bad luck. Due to the sudden appearance of the Wanderer, the puppet they were transporting had escaped. However, he didn't know what was so terrifying about this strange cursed puppet or what kind of damage her escape would cause. After all, she seemed quite harmless while staying on the Wanderer. To be honest, Alexander was quite disappointed. He had thought that he had finally found a channel of information that could help him understand this world, but he didn't expect the person lying in the coffin to be as confused as him. But when his gaze fell once again on Isabella, who was still sitting quietly on the wooden box, his disappointment faded a little. At least, he now had someone to talk to on the Wanderer, even if she seemed to be a puppet, even if her head falling off was quite terrifying, even if she definitely had more secrets, and even if she occasionally spouted nonsense. But she seemed more normal than the noisy ram-headed golem. And speaking of strange dangers, which of the boundless sea, the Wanderer, or the strange things on the ship seemed safe? Even from the perspective of others, he, the Captain Alexander, seemed to be the most dangerous one on the boundless sea. Alexander sighed, and unwittingly, his expression relaxed a bit. He asked in a casual manner, I want to know, what would you do if I threw you overboard again? Isabella blinked. Are you going to stuff a barrel of gunpowder again this time? No. Then are you going to hammer in iron nails? No. Pour in lead blocks? No. Cough. What I mean is, if I refuse to let you stay on the ship, then I'll row back, Isabella said, sitting upright with a calm look on her face. I don't want to be swallowed by this sea. At least there's a place to stay on your ship. Alexander was stunned by the puppet's frankness, so much so that he didn't know whether to call her honest or thick-skinned. After a lot of thought, he managed to say, you could have been a bit more tactful, you already knew the answer anyway, didn't you? Isabella said with a smile, but if I come back, I might try to hide somewhere in the cabin without you noticing. I won't just run out onto the deck. I've just woken up, and I didn't think things through the previous times I came back. But now I have experience, Alexander interrupted her, my perception covers the entire cog ship, and I can even detect the location of each wave hitting the hull. Isabella's words were suddenly choked back. Alexander continued calmly, and I can also choose to destroy you completely, to prevent you from bothering me and my wanderer in a more thorough way. The cursed puppet lady seemed to have not considered this possibility at all. She instinctively widened her eyes, and then there was a click in her neck. The headless cursed puppet lady hurriedly caught her own head and started fumbling to put it back onto her neck. Alexander couldn't keep up the serious atmosphere anymore, and he let out a sigh. After Isabella managed to put her head back on, he continued, but I suddenly feel that it wouldn't be a bad thing to have one more crew member on the Wanderer. If you can behave yourself on this ship, I can find a place for you. You should have said that earlier. You scared me so much my head fell off. Alexander couldn't help but twitch at the corner of his eye. So what's the deal with your neck? Isabella looked innocent. I don't know. I don't usually have many opportunities to get out and about, so how would I know why my body has this problem? Alexander silently stared at Isabella for a few seconds, then said seriously, it seems that long-term bed rest is not good for the cervical spine. Isabella, looking at the speechless cursed puppet lady, Alexander's mood suddenly improved a bit. All right, in any case, the Wanderer has gained a new crew member. Come with me, I'll find you a place to rest. The size of the lost Wanderer was enormous, extraordinarily so. For a sail-powered ship, its scale seemed to Alexander to surpass the necessary limit. Such a large scale meant larger cargo holds, more cannons, a sturdier structure, and a more stable posture in the face of waves, all of which meant it was well equipped to face the most challenging long-distance voyages. However, Alexander currently had no plans for any such voyages. The immense size of this ghost ship only served to amplify his sense of solitude. Therefore, the addition of another crew member who could speak would not be a bad thing. After all, there were plenty of vacant guest rooms on this large ship. Footsteps broke the silence in the corridor as Alexander descended the wooden staircase with the cursed puppet, arriving in the cabin beneath the stern deck. This was located directly beneath the captain's quarters, and structurally, it could be considered the first-class residential area of this large ship. It was somewhat brighter and tidier compared to the dark and eerie areas further below. Alexander stopped in front of a crew cabin and casually pushed open the slightly ajar wooden door. Inside was a sparsely furnished single room. The ship had several single cabins like this, but they had long been unused, with no signs of previous habitation. After an initial exploration of the upper areas of the lost Wanderer, Alexander noticed the existence of these empty rooms. He didn't think much of it at the time, but now that he was personally in charge of this ghost ship and knew its secret of autonomous navigation, a question naturally arose. If the ship didn't need a crew, who were these cabins prepared for? The single rooms in the upper cabins were clearly intended for the chief mate, the first mate, the bosun, and other senior seamen. In the lower areas, there were also common berths prepared for ordinary crew members. Moreover, the ship had a dining room and a tavern clearly intended for multiple people to use. Unlike the sails and ropes, which could operate without human intervention, these facilities were prepared for people. But this ship didn't need a crew. Alexander furrowed his brows slightly. He realized that this ghost ship, now sailing alone on the sea, must have had a crew at some point in its history. At least when the ship was first built, it was designed with adequate facilities for seamen. So what had happened that led the ship to its current state? Where had the original crew gone? Was the real Captain Alexander the owner of the ship from the beginning to the end? What did the mysterious unicorn head know? Captain? A puzzled voice suddenly came from behind. Alexander was startled and turned around, then realized it was the voice of Isabella. He had momentarily forgotten about her existence. Over the past few days, Alexander had become accustomed to being the only living person on the ship. He had gotten used to the voice of the noisy unicorn head, so the sudden addition of Isabella was a bit disconcerting. My name is Alexander. You can call me Captain Alexander, of course. It's up to you if you want to just call me Captain. Alexander quickly composed himself and turned to face the puppet. This empty room is now yours. Go in and take a look. Ah, okay. Isabella nodded, peering over Alexander's shoulder at the room before picking up the wooden box that always floated behind her, hoisting it onto her shoulder, and carefully carrying it into the room. Seeing Isabella's constant companion, the iron box, Alexander couldn't help but smile. He watched as the night puppet carefully placed the iron box next to the bed, meticulously checking the velvet lining inside the box before beginning to survey the room. He couldn't help but ask, "Are you going to carry this box with you all the time?" "Yes," Isabella replied matter-of-factly, "where else would I put it?" "I thought you would mind it, considering it was your seal." Alexander frowned, "but it seems you can't do without it." "The people who sealed me are to blame, not the box." Isabella sat on the box, patting the lid. "Do you want to come in and sit down?" Alexander shook his head. "No need." "How do you feel about this room?" "Ah, very good." Isabella seemed quite pleased. She looked around the sparsely furnished room as if she were in a luxurious palace. "Is that a wardrobe?" "I don't have any clothes to change into, so I probably won't need it, but it's nice to have a closet." "Oh," And a table, I can put things on it in the future, but I don't think I have anything to put on it. Maybe I can use it for my head? It would be more convenient when combing my hair. If you're satisfied, that's good. Alexander watched the Gothic night puppet sitting on an iron box and planning her life, a sight that was quite bizarre, especially when some questionable content appeared in her plans. However, a smile slowly appeared on Alexander's face. He took a step back, his expression returning to normal. You can rest here for a while and get used to the environment. Besides the stairs leading to the lower level, you can move freely on this level and the deck level. The structure here is not complicated, and you should be able to master the location of all the rooms by yourself. I'll be in the captain's private room. If you need anything, you can find me there. If I'm not there, there's a talking unicorn head sculpture on the navigation table. He's my chief mate. Isabella was listening and nodding, but when she heard the last two sentences, her eyes widened. A unicorn head sculpture? That black sculpture? It seems you've already noticed it. I did notice, but you said it can talk. And it's your chief mate? Isabella looked surprised. I thought it was just too incredible. You're a talking, walking night puppet. Alexander looked at Isabella expressionlessly. And you find a talking unicorn head sculpture incredible? Isabella paused, looking down at her hands as if she had just realized. I guess so. Alexander shook his head and turned to leave. That's it, rest here. If you need anything, come find me. Okay, Captain Alexander. Isabella's voice came from behind him. After leaving, Alexander didn't go anywhere else. Instead, he returned directly to his private room. He sat down next to the large navigation table, and the unicorn head sculpture on the table immediately came to life, its head creaking as it turned towards Alexander. Captain Alexander is back. It seems you've settled the lady. You see, just like I said, she's a gentle and harmless lady. She won't hinder your voyage, and she can even keep you company. I see you've decided to keep her on board. What tasks are you planning to give her? The heart of the ocean doesn't require much human intervention. The deck will clean itself, the cannons will clean themselves, the cabins will maintain themselves. Perhaps she can be in charge of managing the kitchen. You seem to have always been dissatisfied with the ship's food. Speaking of food, we might need to replenish some ingredients first. The sea-salted meat and old cheese in the warehouse might be a bit stale. Although crude seamen won't be picky about food at sea, the great Captain Alexander surely. Alexander felt his brain about to boil. At this moment, he was once again convinced of one thing. With this noisy unicorn head around, he definitely needed a normal conversation partner like Isabella. Shut up, he glared at the unicorn head, continuing after it fell silent. You were quiet when Isabella was here. I thought you'd finally learn to keep quiet. A captain should not be interrupted during a crew interview. That's a rule of the sea, even if I am your faithful chief mate, first mate, bosun, and... Alexander cut off the unicorn head. Keep an eye on that cursed puppet in the next few days. Keep an eye on that lady? You're still not sure about her? Oh, yes, necessary caution is part of being a captain. She has many secrets, and she hasn't told them all. Maybe it's because she really doesn't know, or maybe she's deliberately hiding something. In any case, she is ultimately a cursed puppet, and she has the title of a mysterious number 099, Alexander said calmly. The people on that ship used heavy seals to prevent Isabella from leaving the wooden box. But now the sealed cursed puppet is freely moving around on my ship. I need a little time to confirm whether Isabella is really a harmless cursed puppet, even if she's only harmless on the heart of the ocean. Upon taking the helm himself, Alexander gained true control over the Wanderer, able to sense any movement on the ship. However, out of caution, he ordered the unicorn head to keep a close eye on the cursed doll. He knew that he wasn't an expert in the occult, and his knowledge of the supernatural forces of this world was limited. A walking, talking doll was beyond his understanding. Isabella might seem harmless, but if she had any unseen influence, he might not be able to detect it. The unicorn head, on the other hand, would be better equipped for such a task. Even discounting this, Alexander knew that he couldn't monitor the Wanderer around the clock. Although he had decided to survive in this world, he might need to return to the world on the other side of the door at times. When that happened, he might not be able to sense the happenings on the Wanderer. A thought suddenly crossed Alexander's mind, making his gaze shift subtly. He glanced at the unicorn head without a change in his expression. When he returned to his apartment, did the unicorn head notice anything? What was the situation on the ship when he left the Wanderer? These sudden doubts made Alexander feel a bit agitated, but under the empty gaze of the unicorn head, he showed nothing. Instead, he just checked on Isabella. Of course, he didn't have a hobby of spying, even if the other party was a non-human creature. Hence, he just roughly sensed the situation below the deck. Through his connection with the Wanderer, he could at least confirm Isabella's location and whether she was trying to destroy anything. After all, Beneath her harmless and elegant exterior was the nature of a cursed doll, a dangerous entity referred to by ordinary people in this world as Anomaly 099. She was still in the room, probably studying the furnishings and arranging a place to rest. Alexander relaxed a bit. At the same time, the unicorn head suddenly asked, "Captain, what are your plans next? If you're bored, you're loyal. Enough." Alexander glanced at the unicorn head and then placed his hands on the edge of the navigation table. As his thoughts shifted, the feeling of holding the helm returned, and the green flame flowed like water again. In the burning flames, Alexander's body once more turned into a spirit. The spreading fire extended from the navigation table to the outside of the captain's cabin, climbed up the mast and ropes, and caused the translucent magic sail on the mast to billow in the wind. With the main, side, and corner sails adjusting their angles flexibly in the sea breeze, the huge three-mast ship slowly accelerated on the boundless sea. Alexander's gaze fell on the sea chart in front of him. As expected, he saw the gray fog on the chart change instantly. The silhouette representing the Wanderer was slowly moving forward, and the fog surrounding it was dissipating. After a brief moment of thought, he tried to focus his attention on the sea chart. The green flames surrounded the navigation table, conveying the captain's will like an extension of Alexander's body. In this subtle state of connection, Alexander finally had a faint idea of the secret of this clearly supernatural sea chart. With a thought from Alexander, the silhouette on the sea chart representing the Wanderer instantly enlarged a bit, then immediately shrunk back to its original size. Alexander was zooming the picture presented by the sea chart, and this whimsical move was successful, even though no matter how much he zoomed in or out, all he could see at the edge of the chart was fog. But at this moment, Alexander was certain that this sea chart could record and present every inch of the sea explored by the Wanderer, and accurately and real-time display the detailed situation around the Wanderer. Under the empty gaze of the unicorn head, Alexander's face remained expressionless, as if a true captain was seriously observing a sea chart. But a faint sense of excitement surfaced in his heart. His gaze swept over the emerald magical flames rising from his body, and his consciousness sensed the state of the Wanderer and the changes on the sea chart. This strange emerald flame was indeed the key to controlling the Wanderer, and also the key to controlling many strange items on the ship. Perhaps, this is the power of the captain. Alexander pondered the power of this flame. He knew that if he wanted to truly control this ship and survive in this strange world based on this, he had to figure out his abilities. First and foremost, he needed to fully master this flame. As for the next arrangements that the unicorn head mentioned earlier, Alexander looked at the sea chart in front of him, which was slowly changing. He watched the fog slowly dissipating around the silhouette of the Wanderer, and his plans were simple. Since he didn't know enough about this world, and since the map was full of fog, it was definitely right to explore the map first. After all, the purpose of sailing was to wander. Even if Captain Alexander was seen as a world boss wandering in the wild areas in the eyes of the locals in this world, his reputation wouldn't improve even if he and the Wanderer just stayed obediently at sea. As for whether aimlessly wandering around at sea would pose any risks, Alexander thought this way: before he took the helm, this ship had been drifting aimlessly. The Wanderer had never anchored, so where would that extra risk come from? Compared to the previous situation of blind drifting, sailing with full sails could at least dispel the fog on the sea chart, which also meant the end of the completely passive state of being in the fog. Alexander stood up from behind the navigation table, the emerald magic flame on his body gradually dissipating. But in his perception, the translucent magic sails on the mast of the Wanderer didn't disappear, and a part of the emerald flame lingering on the mast and ropes was still burning, continuing to execute the captain's will. Combined with what he observed when taking the helm earlier, Alexander had a faint understanding. Although this ship only hoisted the magic sails in the emerald flame after he took the helm, whether it was the large sails or the many things that run automatically on this ship, they all didn't rely on the power of the captain himself. This ghost ship had its own power source. Although he didn't know what the energy that powered this ship was, it was clear that what he, as the captain, needed to do was just to give orders to the ship. Then, the ship would naturally execute the captain's orders faithfully. Alexander left the navigation table and turned to look at the small door at the deepest part of the captain's private cabin. Behind that door was his private bedroom as the captain. During the initial days of exploring the ship, he had always used that room as a resting place. Now, he needed a relatively quiet environment to thoroughly research what he could do as the captain of the Wanderer. But before that, someone had to watch over this ship that had entered the sailing state. He looked at the unicorn head at the edge of the navigation table and said in a matter-of-fact tone, "You take the helm." "Ha!" The unicorn head was taken aback, sounding surprised. "But Captain, I have things to do. Don't disturb me for a while." Alexander seemed to completely ignore what the unicorn head was about to say, and just casually gave his order. In his other perception, in the information brought by the green flame spreading along the deck outside the cabin, he could clearly see the various connections hidden deep within the ship. Masts, ropes, sails, helm, dragon fire cannons. Everything was invisibly connected, a network resembling nerves or blood vessels ran through the ship, and all these connections ultimately converged in the captain's cabin. The unicorn head was faintly connected to everything. Perhaps, this mysterious and bizarre unicorn head was the Wanderer itself? Or a control mechanism for taking over the entire ship in emergencies? Alexander wasn't the builder of this ship, so naturally, he didn't know how the ship operated. But he thought that if he were the real Captain Alexander, he would surely know what the unicorn head could do. On the other hand, the unicorn head, who always claimed to be the chief deputy, should naturally be able to take the helm when needed. Alexander needed to take a bit of a risk and make some arrangements that he had never made before, but which a true captain must know and would certainly make. After all, even captains need to rest. A second later, the unicorn head made a cheerful and noisy sound. "Ah, all right, Captain. Go ahead with your work, you're loyal." Alexander didn't pay any attention, just waved his hand casually, turned around, and walked into the bedroom at the deepest part of the captain's cabin, closing the door behind him. The door closed behind him, blocking the hollow gaze of the unicorn's head. Yet Alexander could still clearly sense the lost wanderer, feeling every slight change on board this ghost ship. Through this empathy that extended like his limbs, he saw the ship's many sails finally adjusting their angles in the sea breeze, while the black steering wheel at the helm was slightly turning, further stabilizing the lost wanderer amidst the waves. As he had expected, the unicorn's head temporarily took over the helm, diligently fulfilling its duty as first mate, but Alexander could take control of the ship at any time. Compared to when he was steering the ship directly, the lost wanderer was somewhat weakened in terms of agility and speed, but now Alexander's main goal was to further dispel the fog on the sea chart. Without a clear target or course, he didn't mind this minor impact. After confirming that the unicorn head was not acting strangely, and that the gothic puppet below deck was obediently staying in her room, Alexander let out a sigh of relief and took a look at this moderately sized room. This was his private bedroom as the captain and the most comfortable and exquisite room on the Lost Wanderer. Apart from a soft bed, there was a classic wardrobe and a shelf full of odd items against the wall opposite the door. Opposite the bed was a dark brown desk, but there were no books on the desk, only a few ornaments and writing and drawing tools. Next to the desk was a window that gave a direct view of the distant sea, and there were several hooks on the wall next to the window. The pirate sword and flintlock that Alexander currently carried were previously hung on these hooks. Alexander came to the desk, placed the sword and flintlock within easy reach, then opened the desk drawer to check the gunpowder and iron bullets stored in the wooden box. A small brass compass was placed next to the iron bullets and the bag of gunpowder. Alexander picked up the compass and saw that the needle under the glass cover was still spinning wildly, as if it was constantly being pulled by an invisible chaotic field. At the bottom of the compass was a line of tiny engraved words, "We are all wanderers." Alexander casually played with the compass in his hand, watching the needle spin around like a drunkard. Everything here had been checked by him many times. He had discovered this room during his initial exploration, and the things here, including that line of message, must have been left by the real Captain Alexander. After mentally reviewing the information he currently had, Alexander let out a sigh, casually placed the compass on the table, and then raised his right hand to gently rub his fingertips. A small green flame ignited at his fingertips, and under the illumination of the flame, half of Alexander's palm immediately took on a ghostly, transparent and illusory texture, but under conscious control, the flame did not spread wildly as before, but hovered above his fingers like a candle flame. After the flame stabilized, Alexander used his other hand to feel the flame, then took a feather pen from the side and touched the flame with the end of the pen. There was no heat to be felt, and the feather pen was not ignited, only a faint green hue spread on the pen shaft, making the feather pen glow faintly. But Alexander did not feel any feedback from the feather pen, which was completely different from when he touched the sea chart and helm with the flame. Alexander silently noted his new experience. This ghost flame had no temperature and would not ignite objects. It was very likely that it only interacted with the anomalies on the Lost Wanderer and would not respond to ordinary objects. So what would happen if it was an anomaly from outside the Lost Wanderer? Would the flame react? Alexander pondered, and for a moment, the image of a certain gothic puppet suddenly appeared in his mind. Isabella seemed to be an anomaly from outside the Lost Wanderer. Would she be affected by this ghost flame? But he just thought about it for a moment and then immediately discarded this irrelevant thought, because even if Isabella was not a human, even if she was the cursed anomaly item 099, she was also a walking, thinking individual, and now a crew member of the Lost Wanderer. Alexander had subconsciously regarded her as a person that he could not accept using a living person to test his flame. After all, he was still unsure of the profound effects of this flame on the affected anomalies, and whether it was harmful. Alexander then tested a few more times, checking the nature of the flame while confirming whether there were any supernatural attributes behind the various objects in the cabin. Finally, his gaze fell on the small brass compass that had a message. The brass compass lay quietly on the table, with the needle under the glass cover spinning wildly, but it was probably an illusion. When Alexander maintained the flame while casting his unfriendly gaze on the compass, the needle seemed to suddenly freeze for a moment, then it continued to spin wildly as if nothing had happened. Alexander, the damn thing definitely reacted to his gaze just now. Originally, he was a bit wary of this compass. After all, it had a message left by the real Captain Alexander, and he was worried that the already deceased ghost captain might have left some power or trap on this personal item to prevent thieves, so he had not tested the compass with the flame. But after seeing the reaction of the compass, he suddenly made up his mind. Alexander reached out and picked up the compass, the cold touch transmitted to his fingertips. After glancing at the still wildly spinning needle, he directly put the thing into his right hand that was maintaining the ghost flame, and slowly clenched his fist. The ghostly green flame flowed like burning oil, spreading between his fingers, and the surface of the compass quickly ignited a faint flame. In the flame, countless illusions rose and fell, and in the next moment, the needle that had been spinning wildly suddenly stopped and pointed straight at a certain direction in the vast sea. Alexander was moved. At this moment, he clearly felt the feedback from the compass, and confirmed that it was indeed an anomaly that could be controlled by the ghost flame. But before he could carefully perceive the details in this feedback, a sudden gravitational force attacked. Alexander only felt his body sway, and the next second his vision blurred. The furnishings in the captain's private cabin had somehow turned into nothingness, along with the surrounding walls and ceiling that also disintegrated and disappeared like snowflakes in the blink of an eye. In the falling light and shadow, boundless darkness filled his vision. Alexander stood in the center of this darkness in astonishment, alarm bells ringing in his heart. His first reaction was to reach for the flintlock and sword that were just at his side, but the next second he found that only the brass compass was left by his side. It was still firmly held in his hand. Alexander blinked, and in his sight, countless thin rays of light suddenly spread around the brass compass. These rays of light spread and intertwined in the darkness, extending infinitely like a web. Among the intertwined light, countless points of light emerged, some scattered, some gathered like rivers. Against the background of the web of light, they were as brilliant as rivers of stars. Alexander looked at the spectacle before him with some confusion. He was alert and a bit uneasy, but strangely, he did not feel any sense of danger. Instead, in the midst of this dark web of light and dots of stars, he felt a long-lost sense of comfort and peace. The next second, a strange feeling suddenly came over him. Alexander's gaze was involuntarily drawn to a cluster of stars in the web of light. He looked at the starlight, which seemed to be on the verge of falling, as if it was about to plunge into darkness. He instinctively reached out to the starlight. A huge pull came at that moment. Alexander felt as if his soul had taken flight. He involuntarily rushed towards the dim starlight, while the dense web of light woven by the brass compass quickly receded in his sight, and the starlight rivers formed by the surrounding stars also suddenly began to swirl and squirm during the rapid flight. He instinctively looked at his right hand holding the brass compass, only to find that the compass had disappeared at some point. At the same time, just before he touched the dim light, he saw a shadow suddenly coalesce out of the corner of his eye. The shadow seemed to naturally appear as if it had always been by his side, accompanying him as he quickly plunged towards the dim light. Alexander barely made out the shadow as a bird soaring with outstretched wings, but before he could see the details, his vision went black. The heavy sensation from the real world came from his limbs, along with a nauseating smell of rotting flesh, and the grating sound of heavy iron chains dragging on the ground. Cold, damp, the stench of rotting flesh, the noise of chains scraping against the ground. An array of strange sensations flooded Alexander's mind, but for a moment, he couldn't quite manage to open his eyes. At this moment, he felt as if his soul had been split into two parts. One part remained on the wanderer, while the other had been stuffed into a completely unfamiliar body. Like an old, broken machine, this body was difficult to control. Chaotic and confusing sensations were wreaking havoc in his nervous system, mixed with a certain sense of sluggishness and numbness. He tried to open his eyes and move his fingers, but he couldn't feel the existence of these corresponding body parts at all. This uncomfortable feeling lasted for several seconds before the indescribable numbness and sluggishness in his nervous system gradually faded away. Alexander felt his body as if awakening from a long hibernation, and gradually regained the ability to move. He finally opened his eyes and saw the situation around him. What met his gaze was a dim, dungeon-like space. Burning torches were stuck in the stone wall in the distance, the flickering firelight casting a terrifying picture of the surroundings. Alexander saw many people, or rather, many dead bodies, thrown haphazardly amidst the damp, water-soaked mud and rocks. Most of them were in tattered clothes, with a few still dressed in intact garments. Condensed droplets of water fell from the top of the cave, and in the distance, the sound of sewage flowing in what seemed like an underground river or drain could faintly be heard. The sound of chains scraping seemed to come from a tunnel connected to the cave, gradually growing more distant. Alexander blinked, trying to figure out what had happened. He looked down at his right hand and saw a completely unfamiliar and skinny palm, and the tattered clothes on his arm. The bronze compass, which he had been holding, had disappeared. He looked again at the spot beside him. He remembered seeing a shadow following him as he maneuvered through the starlight and the grid of light. The silhouette of the shadow looked like some kind of bird, but naturally, he found nothing. The bird-like shadow seemed not to have accompanied him into the real space. Alexander slowly clenched his fist, suppressing the anxiety in his heart, then tried to rub his fingers together. A very faint emerald flame sprouted from his fingertips. Admittedly, this flame seemed much weaker than what Alexander was familiar with, but he still felt a bit reassured. As the flame ignited, his somewhat confused state of mind also slightly lifted, and he felt more clearly a kind of mental tearing and connection. He clearly sensed that another part of his spirit was not here. He sensed the presence of the wanderer, sensed himself sitting at a desk, holding a bronze compass in his hand. This feeling was very strange, but Alexander immediately had a vague idea of what was happening. His soul had undergone some kind of projection or extension. That projected part of his mind had crossed an unknown distance and was now lodged in another unfamiliar body. And in this projected state, he could still clearly feel the existence of his original body. This must have something to do with the bronze compass. Could this be the ability of that anomalous item? Alexander had some guesses in his mind, but he didn't let wild thoughts occupy too much of his time. After confirming that his original body was still safe and sound, and that his mind was still under control, and that he was now temporarily in an unknown body, he was somewhat reassured and prepared to first ascertain the situation of this new body. The first point that could be confirmed was that the surrounding environment was definitely not on a ship. This was land, the land he had been unable to find after drifting at sea for so many days. The second point was that this gloomy dark cave did not seem to be a good place, and the scattered bodies around did not seem like a normal burial scene. What kind of unfortunate circumstances had led to the body he now occupied being trapped in such a hell on earth? Alexander took a deep breath and sat up. His body had been leaning against a large rock, and the position was not comfortable. But with this one breath and getting up, Alexander suddenly felt a huge anomaly from his body. He felt the air he had breathed in being expelled from his body, a strange and eerie feeling coming from his chest, and his movement of getting up also became distorted. Alexander looked down in surprise and saw a large hole. The hole was in the position of the heart, and whatever was inside had naturally flown away. A cold wind blew from inside, mixed with the breath that Alexander had just breathed in and not yet fully dissipated, and finally dissipated in the damp air. From a certain angle, Alexander could clearly see the scene behind him. My God! Even if he had a thick skin, even if he had gained some worldly experience on the Wanderer, Alexander still felt a layer of cold sweat at this moment. He felt his goosebumps rising one after another, and every hair stood on end. And after this sudden shock, what he realized next was, he was still standing here, and even had the strength to curse. In the case of losing his heart and having a large hole in his chest, he didn't even feel any pain from this body. Is this a corpse? A moment later, Alexander had come to his senses. He further understood his situation and quickly calmed down. Occupying the body of a corpse and getting up to move may not be something to be shocked about. After all, he still has a self-sailing ghost ship, a unicorn-headed first mate that can drive people to the brink of madness, and recently met a cursed puppet that can act separately and is good at sailing on the boundless sea. Which of these is not more shocking than a dead man talking? At least now he's just lost his heart, and Isabella's head is often not on her neck. With these messy thoughts in his mind, Alexander recovered his composure at a speed that surprised even himself. He then checked the condition of his current body, adjusted to the distortion of his movements caused by the strangeness in his chest, and then walked towards the bodies thrown in the dark cave. As I thought. Alexander looked at the first body, and was not surprised when he saw the horrifying hole in the man's chest. It was a middle-aged man with a haggard face and tattered clothes, looking like a beggar on the street. He had been dead for some time, but his wide eyes still conveyed his struggle and despair at the moment of his death. Alexander continued to walk forward, seeing one heartless corpse after another. They lay miserably on the cold stone, with only two exceptions. Those two had ghastly wounds on their heads, as if they had died on the spot from hitting their heads on the stone. Alexander couldn't help but make some guesses. Perhaps these were two people who had ended their own lives before facing the pain of heart extraction. Frankly, the things in this dark cave were a bit too stimulating for ordinary people. Even Alexander felt a bit overwhelmed after checking all the bodies, so much so that after inspecting all the bodies, he had to find a relatively clean stone in a distant place to sit down, slowly sorting out his state, and in the process of calming down, guessing the truth of all this. Obviously, this was a horrifying murder, but from the overly cruel and uniform method of killing, it seemed not just murder, but also revealed a certain evil, ritualistic feel. Alexander called out the emerald flame again, feeling the connection between himself and his original body. He knew he could cut off this soul projection at any time and return to the safety of the Wanderer. But he felt that he needed to figure out what had happened here. Even if it was just to get some information about the land. Alexander took a breath, feeling the emptiness in his chest, and stood up from the large stone where he had been resting temporarily. He looked at the tunnel deep in the dark cave, remembering that the sound of chains scraping had come from there. There was more than just bodies in this underground space, there were other people moving around. Those who could move freely in this terrifying place should be able to give him some answers. Rushing over to check the situation was certainly not safe, but Alexander didn't care. After all, he was now broad-minded. Before leaving the temporary cave, Alexander tore some rags from the nearby corpses to wrap around his body. This was not because he couldn't stand the chill in the cave, but to shield his exposed heart. Though the gaping hole in his chest did not affect Alexander's survival, as a normal person at heart, it was too bizarre to walk around feeling the cold wind blowing through. Covering himself up could at least offer some psychological comfort and reduce the eerie sensation of this draft. Moreover, Alexander also considered the possibility of bumping into others while moving around in this underground space. Having a large hole in the chest might not be conducive to conversations with strangers. Thus, after a simple treatment of his wound, Alexander cautiously left the gloomy, damp cave. He entered a passage connected to the cave, slowly walking towards the depth. This temporarily occupied body was not convenient. Not only the lethal damage to the chest hindered his mobility, but also the body's frailty was evident. The overly weak limbs could barely walk fast, which was incomparable to the ghost ship captain, whose body was obviously beyond human strength. Alexander couldn't see the full view of his current body, but judging from the visible parts, he guessed that this should be a teenager physically weak due to long-term severe malnutrition. Although the soul of a powerful ghost ship captain was controlling this body, it seemed that the strength of the soul could not break through the physical limits brought by this weak body. Unfortunately, there was no other choice for now, so Alexander could only control this barely usable body to slowly explore the deep passage. He knew that with the state of this temporary body, he would be helpless in any crisis, so he could only pray that this shell would last a little longer. The passage was deep, damp and dark, but there seemed to be hidden ventilation holes, with a slight airflow constantly flowing nearby. Every once in a while, one could see torches or oil lamps hanging on the walls, indicating that people had been active here. After a long walk down the passage, Alexander suddenly found that the road ahead was suddenly bright, and man-made traces began to appear in his sight. He saw a fork in the road at the end of the passage. The roads connected by the fork had flat walls and high semicircular arches. The ground was covered with damp, black stones, and 2 water channels ran along the sides of the ground, carrying nauseating sewage. On the walls on both sides of the road, there were openings like drainage channels, from some of which sewage flowed out and was discharged into the water channels below, flowing to the darker distance. An underground drainage system? Alexander quickly realized that this was evidently a large-scale underground drainage system, and the place where he had previously hidden many bodies seemed to be a natural cave structure connected to the underground drainage system. A large-scale underground drainage system, a natural cave connected to the underground drainage system, and hidden bodies. Numerous conjectures popped up in Alexander's mind, and while making various speculations, he was also carefully observing the various details of this underground drainage system. It was large in scale and well constructed. The main supporting parts seemed to be made of stone bricks and iron bars, and could possibly serve as some kind of underground shelter in necessary cases. To build such a thing, the city above this underground drainage system must not be small, and its technologies must have developed to a certain height. Technology cannot exist in isolation. Behind each engineering product is the simultaneous support of countless related industries and technologies. Even a simple underground drainage system, it can reveal to Alexander its construction, planning, material, maintenance levels, and the corresponding resident living concepts. This is enough for Alexander, who is currently severely lacking in information, to get some precious data from the civilized world. Alexander walked along the underground drainage system. After a short walk he suddenly stopped. His gaze fell on the nearby wall. There was a lamp hanging on the wall, an iron lantern with a sturdy metal cage outside. Compared to the torches and oil lamps in the cave, the lamp on the wall was much brighter. The frosted glass shell contained a bright flame that was burning steadily. The light it emitted was enough to illuminate a considerable distance in the underground drainage system. Alexander leaned in to take a closer look. For him now, everything outside the Lost Ark, especially the creations of medieval civilization, was extremely attractive. After observing for a long time, Alexander finally figured out what this light source was. It was an oil lamp. But this oil lamp seemed different from the ones he had seen in the documents. Besides the difference in style, the most obvious was that he saw several delicate symbols on the glass shell of the lamp. The symbols seemed to have been added at the beginning of the lamp shell production, curving and twisting like pictographic characters. Alexander didn't recognize these symbols, but he immediately thought of the mysterious runes he had seen on the mechanical ship and Isabella's sarcophagus. Although the content was different, they all had a similar aura. They were some kind of sacred, ceremonial things. Alexander backed off a bit. He looked up at the deeper part of the underground drainage system, saw that every once in a while on the wall there was a brightly burning oil lamp. As an underground facility that hardly anyone would visit except for necessary maintenance, the lighting equipment in the underground drainage system seemed a bit excessive, and on the outer shell of each oil lamp, there might be similar mysterious runes. This gave Alexander a feeling, as if these densely distributed oil lamps were actually resisting something in this unvisited darkness. The human civilization they represented was resisting something. Alexander walked along the road illuminated by the oil lamps, his eyes simultaneously paying attention to any valuable clues that appeared on the surrounding walls, ground, and dome. Suddenly, he noticed something odd out of the corner of his eye. He stopped between two oil lamps, which was relatively dim in the underground drainage system. He looked up at the higher part of the wall, near the dome of the underground drainage system, where maroon paint was used to depict something. Alexander squinted his eyes, trying hard to discern for a while, and finally made out the picture drawn by those rough lines. He saw pairs of hands reaching towards the sky, as if worshipping something, and above those hands, a ball of light radiating thousands of rays was suspended. Underneath this image of worship and encirclement, there was a line of crooked text. The brush strokes of the text trembled, as if imbued with strong fanaticism and anticipation. The letters were not any known text, but Alexander naturally understood: the holiday will fade, the true sun god will resurrect in blood and fire. All life belongs to the sun, all order belongs to the sun. Alexander stood silently in the underground drainage system, looking up at the darkest junction of the oil lamp light, looking at those maroon graffiti, looking at that sun soaked in blood, radiating thousands of rays, and being worshipped fanatically. As if staring at another world for a long time. He just stood there for a long time, until a noise suddenly came from the depths of the underground drainage system. A few footsteps entered Alexander's ears. He suddenly looked up in the direction where the sound came from, only to see several figures in long robes coming from the front, their faces hidden in the shadow of the hood, appearing in the depths of this filthy underground drainage system like eerie ghosts. Alexander didn't hide. In fact, there was almost nowhere to hide in this straight underground drainage system, and this temporary body, which was inconvenient to move, couldn't perform high-end operations like covert movement. So after a brief consideration, he simply stood in the middle of the underground drainage system, looking very openly at those suspicious hooded people coming from the front. Since this body couldn't escape anyway and was destined to be a one-time consumable, it might as well exchange some information in the end. The next second, those hooded figures who came out from the depths of the underground drainage system noticed Alexander's presence. The figures in long robes and iron helmets naturally noticed Alexander standing unflinchingly in the middle of the road. He still looked as he did when he'd just left the dungeon, his skinny and shriveled body cloaked in tattered clothes, a worn-out cape hastily thrown over his upper body covering a large hole in his chest. He stood nonchalantly in the road, appearing as if he'd been startled by the sudden appearance of the iron helmet men. The robed figures were clearly taken aback, pausing before the leader suddenly shouted, "A sacrifice has escaped." Immediately, Alexander saw them running towards him. Another yelled as he ran, "Quick! Stop him! Don't let him get away!" Alexander shrugged, continuing to watch the approaching figures who, no matter how he looked at it, didn't seem like good people. After weighing the current situation, he had no intention of running, but the men continued to shout as they ran, "Don't let him get away! A sacrifice has escaped!" Alexander's steadfast stance in the middle of the road only made the atmosphere more awkward. The men, who'd been running and shouting, obviously felt something was off midway. Their shouts involuntarily stopped, but they had to continue running towards him. Alexander could almost smell the embarrassment and anger emanating from under their dark iron helmets. Then, these embarrassed and angry men surrounded him. It was only then that Alexander looked around at the figures surrounding him. After a moment's hesitation, he said, "Should I have tried to run? The mood's kind of tense now." The robed figures seemed to ignore Alexander's sarcastic comment, casting a wary and cautious glance at him before looking behind him. Two of them quickly whispered to each other, Alexander faintly hearing their conversation, "Why is there one out? Did the church dogs discover this hiding place? But he doesn't seem to have been released. Anyway, take him back first. This escaped sacrifice is not quite right. We need to deal with it quickly. Let the messenger decide." Alexander had no idea who these people were, nor what they meant by the messenger. But considering the situation he'd observed on his journey and their mention of sacrifice, he had a vague idea of some truths here. He didn't know how he should react to be considered a normal sacrifice, nor did he have any intention of playing along with these people. Outside of the Wanderer's call, using a temporary body, he had very few concerns. So after observing his surroundings, he simply asked, "Where are you taking me?" The robed figures seemed surprised at the calmness of the sacrifice. Although their iron helmets covered their faces completely, Alexander could still guess their surprise. One of the robed figures glared at him through his helmet, his voice low, "You have no right to ask questions, take him away." Several robed figures moved forward, but before they could touch him, Alexander took a step forward, "No need to touch me, I'll go with you." The robed figures looked at each other, probably thinking that this sacrifice was mentally unstable, but the leader waved his hand, "That's good, anyway, you can't escape. Come with us, you might be able to face your glory with dignity." The robed figures surrounded Alexander, blocking all his escape routes, and led him deeper into the sewer. The stench in the sewer was nauseating, but the robed figures seemed not to notice, walking calmly on the dirty and moldy path. Alexander kept his face expressionless, silently following the figures, listening to their conversations. They didn't talk much, but in the occasional exchanges, Alexander heard useful words like Bergamo, ruler, and temple. "Is this the Duchy of Bergamo?" Alexander suddenly asked, as casually as if he were chatting with an acquaintance. "No shit." One of the robed men responded reflexively, then remembered himself, and gave Alexander a devilish look. "You're pretty calm, kid, do you know what's going to happen next?" "I can guess," Alexander nodded, even smiling, then he asked tentatively, "The true god of light, right?" The robed figures clearly paused for a moment. They seemed to misunderstand Alexander's unusual reaction, one of them whispering to a companion, "Wait, is this also a believer of the Lord?" "Impossible, he's clearly an escaped sacrifice." Another robed figure whispered back, then looked at Alexander, "You're quite clever, but don't think you can avoid the sacrifice. The Lord has already decided your fate, you'd better accept it willingly." Alexander made no response. He knew his overly calm reaction had led these cultists to make a mistaken assumption. They probably thought he was pretending to be calm and posing as a believer to try to survive, but only Alexander knew the truth. This temporary body was so difficult to control that even normal movements were strenuous. The muscles on his face were as stiff as if they were necrotic. Of course, he could only maintain a calm and expressionless face. But he didn't care what these cultists thought. He just wanted to collect as much information as possible during this one-time exploration. So he casually asked, "Do you think that sun in the sky now is a false sun? Do you think it will eventually fall? The false sun will surely fall." This was clearly a topic that could stimulate these cultists, and Alexander successfully heard their enthusiastic and fanatical response. Even the temple dogs have to admit in the annals that the sun in the sky is a twisted and bizarre thing that appeared after the Great Obliteration. The real sun that brings life and order to the world is the God of light, but my lord has been usurped by that vile false thing. That vile false thing will surely fall from the sky one day. Then, Alexander heard the cultists around him responding, "The false sun will surely fall. The true God of light will soon revive. The excess sea water in the world will be driven back into the void by the power of the God of light, and the land will return to a fertile and stable era." Listening to the cultists, who were clearly getting carried away, Alexander was quickly sorting through his thoughts. He knew that these fanatical cultists could not be reasoned with, and what they firmly believed was most likely distorted and tampered information. But some of the information they revealed was still worth considering. That sun hanging in the sky is a false object, the real sun has been usurped. They firmly believe that the real sun is a fallen god, and they believe that this god will revive from blood and fire. They also mentioned the excess sea water in the world, and mentioned the fertile and stable era. What do these words mean? Alexander's mind was filled with thoughts, while the dark cultists soon calmed down. They remembered their job, remembered that they were escorting an escaped sacrifice. So the ones closest to Alexander fell silent, while the two at the back of the group whispered a few words. "Do you find this sacrifice a bit weird? He seems off. I'm a bit uneasy. Could this sacrifice have stayed in the dark dungeon too long when he escaped, and his mind was? That's just as well. The power of the Lord will purify him." Alexander listened to the conversation behind him. He paid particular attention to the words, "dark dungeon." But just as he was hoping to glean more information from this conversation, the leading robed figure stopped. "We're here." The voice of the dark cultist, cloaked in a black robe, was cold and low. Alexander was slightly disappointed, but immediately, his attention was drawn to the scene in front of him. At the end of the road ahead, where several dungeon paths intersected, was a wide space like a small underground hall. In it was a meeting place for the dark cultists. The scale of this underground drainage system was massive, surpassing the necessity of a mere city sewage system in Alexander's eyes. The oil lamps adorned with runes and the reinforced structures that could serve as shelters scattered throughout the system led him to speculate about the purpose of this underground facility. No matter what intentions the builders initially had, one fact was evident: deep within this vast infrastructure, hidden from the world above, this dark and cold place had become a breeding ground for some sinister power. A cult that, in name, worshipped the sun god, but only instilled a sense of chill. The intersection of several corridors in the drainage system opened up into a large subterranean space. Sturdy stone pillars supported a dome made of bricks and stones. Iron pipe structures crisscrossed near the dome like a spider's web. Bright oil lamps illuminated the entire space, and the crowd gathered at this junction. At least several hundred robed figures congregated in this dank, polluted place. In the middle of them was a raised platform, upon which stood a tall figure also robed in black, clearly the highest ranking among them. This man on the platform wore no hood like the others, but rather a golden mask. The mask was peculiar, resembling a disc radiating endless flames and etched with countless fragmented cracks. Behind the masked man on the platform was a peculiar totem, a tall wooden stake topped with a burning brazier. The core of the brazier appeared to be some kind of metal with numerous small holes from which the flames spewed. When Alexander was escorted here, this was the scene he saw. The robed figures gathered in the assembly area also noticed him. We caught a runaway sacrificial subject on our way to the assembly area. One of the black-robed figures who had been responsible for escorting him stepped forward and respectfully reported to the leader on the platform, a hint of self-congratulation in his tone. This sacrificial subject has been in the darkness for too long and his mind is somewhat confused. May you manifest your power and let the glory of our Lord descend upon this pitiful body. The cult leader on the platform, wearing the golden mask, turned his gaze upon the expressionless Alexander, his voice tinged with surprise and coldness. A runaway sacrificial subject? Alexander made no response. He was merely observing this place with curiosity, including the golden mask on the face of the cult leader and the totem of the burning brazier behind him. Perhaps, to the common people of this world, these symbols were strange and bizarre, but he recognized them almost immediately. They were imitating the sun god. Not imitating the orb of light bound by numerous streams of flame and 2 layers of rune circles in the sky today, but the sun god Alexander was familiar with, the one radiating brilliant light, burning fiercely. These people were indeed worshipping the sun god, a sun god that seemed to have fallen in a very ancient era, and they were worshipping it as a deity. Alexander lifted his head, looking calmly at the high-ranking priest looking down at him from the platform. Perhaps it was because of the necrosis of his facial muscles that his calm demeanor seemed more like a numbness devoid of intellect to the other party. The high-ranking priest wearing the golden mask made eye contact with Alexander for less than 2 seconds before turning his head to instruct someone standing next to the platform, "Go check the detainment area for sacrificial subjects. Be quick." After giving his orders, he nodded to the robed followers who had escorted the sacrificial subject back, his tone containing a hint of praise. "You have done well. Even a small merit in the eyes of the Lord will transform into eternal glory for you when the true sun god illuminates the world again." This routine, bland praise seemed to be a great encouragement to the followers in black priest robes. They became excited, praising the true sun god while pushing Alexander to the front of the platform. The high-ranking priest wearing the golden mask only addressed Alexander at this point. "Poor one who has lost his way, have you felt the deep cold amidst the dark stone walls and soil?" Alexander didn't understand what this charlatan was saying and could only remain silent. The priest obviously didn't care whether the sacrificial subject in front of him had any reaction. His words were not for Alexander, but rather for the surrounding followers and the sun god he firmly believed in. Cold and darkness are the pain that the false sun god has brought to this world. Under the reign of the false sun god, the deep dark sea rages across the world, with only fragmented pieces of land for the living beings to barely survive. But even on these fragmented lands, people find it hard to escape from suffering. The shadows of the old days lurk underground, their claws that devour people writhing in the lightless caverns. Hatred and strife fill the world above, the pure souls of humans tainted by the breath of the evil god. How can we endure this long suffering? How can we endure the twisted, absurd world brought by the false sun god? We cannot endure, we only wish for our Lord to return, for the true sun god to descend upon the earth again, burning fiercely from blood and fire, bringing back order and prosperity to the world. Under the stirring tone of the high priest in the golden mask, Alexander could clearly feel the atmosphere in the assembly area changing. The followers in black priest robes became excited one by one. They echoed the high priest's words, which quickly turned into fervent shouting, "May the true sun god descend upon the earth again. Burning fiercely from blood and fire. May the true sun god descend upon the earth again. Burning fiercely from blood and fire. May the true sun god descend upon the earth again," the high priest on the platform said loudly, then pointed at Alexander, "And today, our Lord will awaken further from his slumber, the blood of the lost one will soothe the scars left by the shattering of the light. Bring the sacrificial subject forward." Several people in black priest robes rushed forward, but Alexander was faster, he didn't need to be pushed, he climbed onto the altar himself. Though this body wasn't very useful, it could still climb a platform. After climbing up, he came face to face with the high priest in the golden mask, who was still maintaining the majestic and mysterious posture from when he had given the order. The sudden change and the unexpected development left the cult leader momentarily stunned. He stared at Alexander through the golden mask, and the surroundings of the platform fell into an eerie silence. Alexander, however, seemed completely oblivious to the change in the atmosphere. He just felt that he had gathered more information about this world and was very much looking forward to seeing more unusual scenes before this temporary body breaks down. So, with a sense of exploratory anticipation, Alexander rubbed his hands together and inquired earnestly, "What's next? How do we proceed?" The high priest in the golden mask. "Didn't you hear me?" Alexander frowned, but because his facial muscles weren't working well, he didn't succeed in frowning. "I'm asking, what are we supposed to do next?" It was at this point that the priest finally responded. Although his face was covered by the mask, his eyes revealed a momentary confusion. However, he quickly regained his composure and said in a deep voice, "The darkness of the abyss has indeed affected your mind, but rest assured, the Supreme Sun God will end your suffering. Bring the sacrificial subject to the statue." Two robed figures immediately walked onto the platform from the side, pulling Alexander by the arms towards the mysterious statue topped with burning flames. Alexander wasn't very familiar with this step, so naturally he couldn't cooperate in advance, but he still maintained a non-resistant state, standing obediently under the fiery statue under the restraint of the two robed figures. Although Alexander made no resistance, the two robed figures holding his arms still used great force as if they were afraid that the sacrificial subject would violently resist at the last moment. Their strength was so great that Alexander could even feel the skeleton of this temporary body cracking bit by bit, which made him look at the two robed figures in surprise. Then, the masked priest came over again. Alexander's attention was immediately drawn to him. He saw the priest take out a peculiarly shaped dagger from his bosom. The dagger was curved and twisted like a gnarled knuckle, its blade as black as obsidian, reflecting the fire from the statue on its surface, looking uncannily eerie. Alexander quietly prepared to sever the soul projection. He knew that this temporary body had probably gathered all the information it could. The priest's prayer echoed on the platform, "O Supreme Sun God, please accept this sacrificial ceremony on the platform. I offer you the heart of this sacrificial subject, may you return from blood and fire." Alexander immediately halted his action of severing the soul projection, looking at the cult priest in front of him as if he were an idiot. "Did you not understand?" Alexander frowned, but because his facial muscles weren't working well, he couldn't frown. "I'm asking, what are we supposed to do next?" At this point, the priest finally reacted. Although his face was covered by the mask, his eyes revealed a momentary confusion. However, he quickly regained his composure and said in a deep voice, "The darkness of the abyss has indeed affected your mind, but rest assured, the Supreme Sun God will end your suffering. Bring the sacrificial subject to the statue." Two robed figures immediately walked onto the platform from the side, pulling Alexander by the arms towards the mysterious statue topped with burning flames. Alexander wasn't very familiar with this step, so naturally he couldn't cooperate in advance, but he still maintained a non-resistant state, standing obediently under the fiery statue under the restraint of the two robed figures. Although Alexander made no resistance, the two robed figures holding his arms still used great force as if they were afraid that the sacrificial subject would violently resist at the last moment. Their strength was so great that Alexander could even feel the skeleton of this temporary body cracking bit by bit, which made him look at the two robed figures in surprise. Then, the masked priest came over again. Alexander's attention was immediately drawn to him. He saw the priest take out a peculiarly shaped dagger from his bosom. The dagger was curved and twisted like a gnarled knuckle, its blade as black as obsidian, reflecting the fire from the statue on its surface, looking uncannily eerie. Alexander quietly prepared to sever the soul projection. He knew that this temporary body had probably gathered all the information it could. The priest's prayer echoed on the platform, "O Supreme Sun God, please accept this sacrificial ceremony on the platform. I offer you the heart of this sacrificial subject, may you return from blood and fire." Alexander immediately halted his action of severing the soul projection, looking at the cult priest in front of him as if he were an idiot. "Did you not understand?" Alexander frowned, but because his facial muscles weren't working well, he couldn't frown. "I'm asking, what are we supposed to do next?"